Hey, welcome everybody. Nice to see you all. Happy to be here. We're in the month of Elul, the month of spiritual preparation before the high holidays. And so I suggested last time, as I did last year, that in the month of Elul, when we always study the Parsha. Every week we study the Parsha. That's our collective conversation. But when we study it during the month of Elul, it's hard. Our collective conversation is also focused on that spiritual preparation. And so it's hard not to read. There's a desire that I have to read our stories with an open heart and an eye towards my own inner work. The problem is they're not stories. The problem is the reading that happens to fall out at this time of year is reading from the book of Deuteronomy. And right now, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy contains some retelling of stories up front and has some stories at the end. But right now, we're in the thickest, densest forest of laws that the Torah has to offer us. It's a catalog, one after another. And in fact, this week's Torah portion, Parshat Ki-Tetzei, has more is distinguished as having more laws, more mitzvot than any other single Parsha in the Torah. It's just law after law after law after law. You know, and that if this is the most, then there are other Parshas that are full of law. So what do we do? How do we kind of studying laws, principles of justice? I mean, the holidays in themselves have all kinds of court justice law metaphor. But I want to offer us or suggest another tool for getting into the heart of the law. And that is that the book of Deuteronomy also has an abundance of a very particular kind of law, what they call in legal history casuistic law, what we would call more simply case law. And you can tell that case law is coming in the Torah when you spot one word at the outset, and it's the word that begins our parsha, ki tetzei lemilchama, when you go out to war. So casuistic law always has a when. Case law has a case. If this thing happens in this circumstance, then the law is the following. This must be done. This punishment. It is not a law that is universally applicable, right? And like in all circumstances, you don't, kill kids. In all circumstances, that's universally applicable. But case law is, well, if you find yourself in this situation. So if you go out to war, I mean, I was thinking as thou shalt not kill, but that's actually not universally applicable, because if you go out to war, there are rules of killing and of combat. And okay, though that's big picture case law, but there are all kinds of little case laws, like if two people get into a fight, and all of those laws are sort of what we call in the tradition b'di'evet. We hope this doesn't happen, but if it happens, this is what must be done. Anyway, why do I say all this? When you see these laws, the laws themselves contain a little bit of a story. In order to state the law, we have to tell a story. And sometimes that story is not just serving the law, but seems to echo some larger story, some ongoing story, some story that we already know. And so we're going to see that's with that sort of the ellipses. Let's say a blessing over our study today, and then start to take a look at the laws in front of us, and maybe start to see some of the stories embedded in the laws. Okay, so let's say a blessing over our Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so here's the law that we're going to start with now. I said sometimes these case laws, they have stories, and they seem like deeper stories than just a setup for the law. And the first 3 laws in Parshat Ki Tetzei are all laws like that. They're horrible laws. They're horrible. They presume a horrible circumstance. The first of those laws, Ki Tetzei, is like when you go out to war and you have captives. What do you do if one of those captives is a woman? And now she's a captive? What do you do in that situation? Basically, like a prisoner of war. Do you rape her? Do you not rape her? Really horrifying stuff. But that's case number 1. And the case number 3, right? We're gonna be looking at case number 2 today. Case number 3 is the case of the son who is such a so out of control that his parents bring him to the court and ask to have him killed because he's so reckless and out of control. Horrible laws, horrifying laws. Okay, that is to say, horrifying cases. What the law is, well, we can decide whether the law handles it well or not. But they're horrifying circumstances. The idea that there's some parent out there that wants their child dead, the rabbis couldn't stand that. Unwrote the law, but that's a different story. The idea that you ought to be able to just take a woman in war, the rabbis couldn't stand that. They unwrote the law, but that's a different story. The law we're going to look at today is the one in the middle, and I want to show it to you first, and I want to see if you can see the story in between the law. Before I share with you the source, the sheet, I want to just look at the first case together. Okay, here it is. Deuteronomy chapter 21. If a man has 2 wives, and that was allowed in ancient biblical law. If a man has 2 wives, one loved and the other hated. One loved and the other hated. I retranslated this because it said, the translation I got said one loved and the other unloved. That is not the language. The language is ahuvah and snua. One loved and one hated. And both the loved and the hated have borne him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the hated one. The firstborn is the son of the hated one. When he wills his property to his sons, he may not treat as firstborn the son of the loved one in disregard of the son of the hated one who is older. He can't favor the younger son, even though that's the son of the wife he really loved. Can't do that. Is anyone hearing a story here? Can't do that. Instead, he must accept the firstborn, the son of the hated one, the son of Ben Hasnua. What a phrase, the son of the hated one, and allot to him a double portion of all he possesses. That's the standard rule of the Bechor, of the firstborn, of the birthright, is that it's a double portion. We talk a lot about birthright in Jewish tradition. We'll talk about it a lot today, but the standard law is the first receives a double portion, everybody else gets half because the first will carry on the household. Okay, instead he must accept the firstborn, the son of the hated one, and allot to him a double portion of all he possesses, since he is the first fruit of his vigor. The birthright is his by law. What a flourish at the end there, huh? Since he is the first fruit of his vigor, reshit ono, lo mishpat bechora, the birthright is his by law. Okay. It's a horrible story. It's a horrible story. What? 2 wives, I mean, that's complicated enough. One of them he loved and one he hated. And the law is worried that he might favor the son of the beloved wife and disregard the son of the hated wife. Now, whose story is this? What story is this? What's going on here? Yeah, Elizabeth.
Sorry, hang on one sec, listen. Okay, go ahead.
They changed something lately in the muting system. I'm noticing this a lot. Can you unmute, Elizabeth? Yeah.
Oh, Cain and Abel.
Good. Why Cain and Abel?
Well, because he loved one son. I mean, we just talked about that, the preferring one son over the other son, but so many of the stories we've seen, and I think a law like this exists because it's one's nature to love the one one loves, and yet you are forced to actually do the right thing, which is to treat people the way you're supposed to treat them according to their birth order or whatever.
Excellent. Okay, so Elizabeth takes us all the way back, and Elizabeth is right that this, so we've talked about it many times in this space, this idea of the choosing of the first and the second and favoring the younger, and who gets favored and who's the elect and who inherits the birth. That's Genesis, one of the major themes of Genesis, and weirdly so, surprisingly so. Why is the Torah obsessed with this? But from the very start, there seems to be a struggle between brothers and a favoring that incites that struggle, or at least adds fuel to the fire. And the first favoring was God favoring Abel over Cain. So God started it, and there's a problem here that keeps going. Okay, that's right, but it's not the answer in the sense that there's a more specific answer that I'm actually looking for something here. Wayne, you want to take a crack at it? No, that's not to put any pressure, because Elizabeth is right. All of that history is good, and whatever we add is good. But there's one case I'm looking for here.
I was just trying to make just a side note that I thought it was ironic that the hated one would bear a child before the loved one.
Yeah, that is ironic. That you wouldn't expect that.
No.
And again, that's interesting. Whose story is that? Where do we see such a story? All right, let's keep generating. Allison Goldman, nice to see you. I haven't seen you in a while.
Hey, I'm thinking of Jacob and Rachel and Leah and how he loved Joseph.
Okay, good. So that is the right answer also. 95%.
Okay.
95%. I'm looking for 5% more, but that's the right answer. Let's take Allison's exactly right. So Jake said, first of all, in the great war of sibling rivalries, Jacob is at the very center of it. Jacob is the ultimate sibling rival because he's the younger of twins. So it's all the more confusing.
Well, that's funny. I was thinking of Jacob as the father, but you're right. Jacob and his brother.
And right, I was going to say that you're right. You're exactly right. And Jacob is at the heart of the favoring of the next generation that takes up the rest of the story. So on both ends, Jacob is sort of like the axis point of this dilemma. And Allison is right that in the Jacob story, Jacob loves Rachel, who gives birth to Joseph. And he loves Joseph the most. And that's the problem. So you're 100% right. That's half of the equation. The other half is that he had another wife, and her name was Leah, and he hated her. Did he hate her? Wait a minute. Did Jacob hate Leah? Let's go look. All right, let's go look. All right, now I want to share this with you. I'm like confused by my own screen sharing. Now let me give you this source sheet. Yeah, nope, that's the YouTube. One sec. Takes a minute here because I have to turn it into an HTTPS link so that it links up in the, isn't that interesting? Okay, all right, so that's the source sheet, and let's go. Let's take a look now. Let's take a look at where Allison was pointing us. Here we are. Okay, so that's your view. I'm gonna do my view here. I like the editing view, looks a little cleaner. So here we are with Jacob. Jacob cohabited with Rachel also. So he had two wives, right from the start. Mark, I think you're unmuted. He also loved Rachel more than Leah. V'yehav gam et Rachel mileah. Now that I know that. Yes, he loved Rachel more. It's very tragic. He loved Rachel so much, but he was also married to this woman that he didn't love as much. But did he hate her? The Eternal saw that Leah was hated. V'yarashem ki snu'a Leah. Same language, hated. What the? Hated. V'yiftach et rachma, and God, sorry, this is God, and God opened her womb. And God opened her womb. But Rachel was barren. Leah conceived and bore a son. You see that? Leah conceived and bore a son, Wayne. Leah, the first one, conceived and bore a son. The hated wife conceived and bore a son. And she named him Reuben. V'tikrashmo Reuben. Now, okay, let me just finish the sentence. She named him Reuben, for she said, the Eternal has seen my affliction. For now my husband will love me. It's such a sad line. It's such a sad line. Kiata ya'aveni ishi. Now my husband will love me. But let's also, for a minute, take a look at who's at the center of this drama, right? Jacob, Rachel, Leah. We know that Joseph is going to be the favorite son. Who's the firstborn? Reuben. Reuben is the firstborn of Israel. There are 13 children that we know of. 13 children, and Reuben is the first. The first. Reuben is the inheritor, the king of the tribes. Reuben. How can we never talk about Reuben? Whatever happened to Reuben? All right, so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk a little bit about Reuben, and we're going to start talking about Reuben by looking just at his name here, because this is a thing that the Torah does. There's a pun. There's a bit of wordplay here. Right? In a lot of the naming, there's a double naming and you hardly notice it. Leah conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben. And what does Reuben mean? Reuben means, look, a son. It couldn't be more straightforward. That's exactly what it means. Re'u ben, look, a child, look, a son. But she named him, look, a son, ki amra, because she said the Eternal has seen, ra'ah, that's the same, look, see, my affliction, bi'onyi, for now my husband will love me. So Reuben is called, look, a son, look, Jacob, I bore you a son, look, just please look. But secretly, Reuben is called, look at my affliction, look at my suffering, look at my pain. Now that is quite a lot. That's quite a lot. That's quite a lot to be putting into one name. Okay. But there's one more connection before we really blow this conversation wide open. There's one more connection. So I think it's fair to say that that there's a parallelism between the law of the man who hates one wife, loves the other, and then favors the son of the beloved one and casts out the son of the hated one. Okay, there's a pretty strong parallel there. I want to make it airtight, right? So far it's like, it seems, oh yeah, okay, that's a good literary parallelism you're drawing. I want to make it like, I want to prove it to you. And it's the next text that proves it, because the law in Deuteronomy had that strange phrase that he can't disregard the firstborn because it was reshit, the first fruit of his vigor. Where have we seen that before? Once and only one other time in the entire Torah does that phrase appear. And here it is. It is in the blessings that Jacob gives to all of his children, all of his sons, actually, before he dies. And he starts with Reuben. He's on his deathbed. And he says, Reuben, you are my firstborn. Reuben Bechori, Ata Kochi, you are my might. And the first fruit of my vigor. Vereshit oni. Yeter se'et v'yeter oz. Exceeding in rank and exceeding in strength. Okay. So that's, I hope you're convinced. I mean, that's Reuben. That's Reuben. So wait, Reshit Oni, first fruit of my vigor, first fruit of his vigor, the hated one, the loved one. There's a, I used to study at Berkeley Law School, and there was a professor there once of ancient law, David Dalby. And David Dalby had this incredible, he had an incredible book on how Deuteronomy, the laws of Deuteronomy are a kind of a commentary on the stories of Genesis. It was like one of his great insights. So I hope that at this point you believe that this law is referencing the story in Genesis. Okay. The question is, what is it saying? What is it saying? And we're soon gonna get into the story. We're gonna make it very, very complicated indeed. But before we go there, maybe let's just pause for a moment and ask, okay, now we've got this law that says you can't disinherit the firstborn, you can't do that. And we know that like that was done, or that favoring was done. Anybody want to like is already feeling like, yeah, I see what Deuteronomy is doing. So let me start with Hyro. Hyro, are you or am I introducing a new question that you're not?
Well, the question I had is why wasn't the man ordered to divorce the unloved wife before he had children? Would that have simplified the whole issue?
Yeah. Don't stay married to a woman you hate. How
Right.
about that for a great law?
Especially if you have another wife that you actually do love. It makes
Like,
no sense.
why are we trapped in this miserable situation? Now, of course, to a certain extent, we presume that in the ancient world, love wasn't driving everything and there were arrangements and people had tribes. That's part of it. But as a matter of principle, ethic, and pathos, because this law is interested in pathos, love and hate, Hyra's question is really, isn't there a better solution than just deal with it and don't cheat the firstborn? Right? Like this thing, ugh. Okay, great. Joni?
Hi, could you help me please? When Sarah asks Abraham to banish Ishmael and Hagar, what's the birth order? Doesn't Ishmael is the first
Ishmael's older. Ishmael's
Right.
older. Yes.
Right.
Ishmael's older. Esau is older. And then I guess Reuben is older.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, okay, great. So that's right. I mean, this, in some ways, what Joni is suggesting beautifully with just a question is that this law is not just a critique on Jacob's handling. I think Jacob, appears to the modern eye as a suspicious figure. Like it's all his wheeling and dealing and anger and trickery, and doesn't seem so. So it's easy. We get into this thing where we critique Jacob, but I mean, this has been happening all along. This idea of like, no, it's got to be the younger. And after all, as Elizabeth opened with, God makes that decision sometimes. There actually isn't the message of Genesis that you don't favor the firstborn? And maybe that's a good message because you're not just giving it to whoever came out first. You're like letting a covenant be inherited by the spiritual warrior of the time, right? Like the next Rebbe. This makes sense, right? We have a way of explaining, of thinking through this. Yeah. So this is like a dilemma. The harshness or the sort of the stark clarity of you give the firstborn the birthright seems like, wait, did you read the book of Genesis? All right. Let's take a comment from Florine, and then I want to blow things up.
I guess I'd need to know what the rules were for polygamy in Israel, because I've studied the rules of polygamy in other parts of the Middle East. And often they will not divorce a wife because then she can never remarry in certain cultures.
Yeah.
And her life is ruined. And also in some of the rules that I've read, there's prescribed sexual relations that have to be taken place, whether you love her or you don't love her.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
do you know what the rules were toward the so-called Jewish interpretation of polygamy?
Yeah, thanks for that, Florian. That's helpful perspective because it is true also that the Torah generally seems to presume that it would be an offense to a woman to divorce her. That is, it's generally assumed that that would be bad for. It's a lot to get into right now. I think we won't be able to really flesh out this ethic because it's so different from ours. But for example, very often when a woman is sexually assaulted, the prescription is that you have to marry her, right? It's a totally, obviously, an entirely different way of conceiving of sexuality and power and relationship, but security is a part of it. To whatever extent we want to try to understand that ethic, part of what we have to understand is this idea that the Torah presumes, and the rabbis did also, which is that casting a woman out just because you don't like her anymore actually would be like throwing her into the desert. Because that's what Abraham did to Hagar, after all, right? That wasn't a good situation when it was time, let's like create family peace by kicking one of the wives out, okay? So anyway, yeah, that is a part of our discussion here. Okay, I see some hands up. I have a lot of material that I've been processing this week and that I want to show you. We're going to look at a third of it today, which is fine. I'll indicate which pieces we're going to skip because we don't have time. But I put a very specific pause right here. So far we just have the kernel of the story, but the story is much more complicated than that, much more. And maybe some of you, I thought, maybe I hide the ball, all the way at the end. Oh, but did you know this? Because there is a way in which the thing that we're about to look at next is so extreme, so egregious, so horrifying that it almost sort of like ironically doesn't get noticed. Because it's hard to even work it. We read through, we know, maybe you've seen this before, maybe you haven't even noticed. But Jacob hints at it in the second line of his blessing to Reuben. He says that, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the first fruit of my vigor, exceeding in rank and exceeding in strength. Okay, that's the Reshit Toni. But unstable as water, pachaz kamayim, al totar, you shall exceed no longer. Ki halita mishkavei avicha, for when you mounted your father's bed, then you brought disgrace. Az chilalta. Yitzui Allah. My couch he mounted. Okay, that's like, it's like poetic as these blessings are, but let's just read that again. Unstable as water, you shall exceed no longer, for when you mounted your father's bed, then you brought disgrace. My couch he mounted. Now, this is, okay, so now we start to see, this is not a blessing. You were my first fruit. You were the first fruit of my vigor, right? But there's a problem with you. You're unstable. And it's because you mounted my bed, my couch. He mounted my couch. Now, what is he talking about? What is he talking about? Is he saying that there's something weird sexual that happened? Some of you know what he's talking about, yeah? Anybody know exactly what he's talking about? I see some nodding heads out there. Leah, I want to let you share with us, and also you've had a comment from before, so maybe we'll just pause and hear from you.
Okay. He's talking about that Reuben had sexual relations with Jacob's wife after Rebecca dies. Okay, that's mounting his couch. I think the whole thing, this is going to go back to, let's call the chapter "No Funny Business," no more funny business. Uh-huh. I think somebody said last week that we're like a religion based on trickery. You know, it was Jacob. It may not have been premeditated that Jacob grabbed Esau's heel as he was being born, but then the rest of the stuff, tricking Esau into selling his birthright for a mess of pottage. Then the whole thing with Rebecca is in on this to push Jacob forward. So this is premeditated trickery to turn things upside down. Jacob, and so it's not surprising to me that Jacob would have a son who's unstable as water.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that, Leah. Both because you're exactly right on, and also because Leah begins to frame for us a debate that we're now going to have for the rest of our class, because we're going to try Jacob. We're going to put him on trial. We're going to see, what is this law saying about Jacob? What's the prescription here? And Leah suggests that this law, as David Dalby would suggest, this law is a way of the Torah not wanting to say, Jacob, you have been a trickster and an abuser, a family ruiner. The Torah's not going to say that. So the Torah says, it would be nice if from now on we didn't lie and favor people and ruin everybody's lives. Okay, that's the law now, right? So is this law a critique of Jacob, which it very well may be, or is there something? We're looking into a story here, remember. We're kind of trying to get our hearts open to what's happening here. And the story is already heartbreaking. The story is of a boy who was born to a mother that his father hated. And he had no control over that. And he was cast aside for that, but he's the firstborn. Okay, so the firstborn, the first fruit of his vigor. I just want to point out, by the way, first fruit of his vigor is also a weirdly sexual connotation. The first fruit, there's something very visceral, almost graphic about that. But let's delay no further with the big reveal here, which is that Jacob says, you would have been the first, but you mounted my couch. Sounds like he's saying you slept with my woman or something. Could that make sense? And yet that's exactly what happened. Leah's right. That's exactly what happened. So this is just let's go a little out of order here. The first fruit of my vigor. Let's go a little bit out of order to source number 5 here. While Israel stayed in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. Remember, Jacob has 2 wives and then 2 maidservants that he's also married to. They each have a maidservant and he's married to them as well. So he has 4 wives, 2 of them with concubine status, and Reuben goes and sleeps with one. And Israel found out. It's just one line in the Torah. There's no other commentary on it, except perhaps that it's interesting that then the very next thing is that they name the sons of Jacob, and that Reuben is called the firstborn, Bechor Yaakov. So there's there's something here, given what we're talking about, there's some connection here. But wait a minute. This is a big reveal, right? In the documentary, this is the moment where you're like, oh my gosh, I thought I followed the narrative, but I didn't follow the narrative because Reuben slept with one of his aunts, one of Jacob's wives. And actually, Leah's quite right. There's a very, very important thing that Leah said, which is that this happens right after Rachel dies. Rachel dies on the road, and that's an interesting connection, right? So, okay. So and I was just like, that's a bomb. I just threw a bomb into the crowd. So I don't where do we go with that? Where do we go with that? Reuben was disinherited by his father because he slept with his father's wife. Now, I'm sorry. And, all of the terrible gender kind of hierarchy of the past notwithstanding, still, that's a pretty good reason to disinherit your son. I get it. I get it. I mean, I don't know. What do you think? Does anyone else feel like Jacob is saying, listen, you're unstable here. You used to be the firstborn, but there's something wrong with you because you slept with your aunt. You, right? Or not just you, but also like, how dare you have slept with my wife? I mean, come on, right? Okay, let's get some thoughts on this. Yonatan?
I'm going to take this in a kind of a radical direction. And I'm going to say that this law and the story of Jacob and Reuben stand as an analogy or allegory to God's relationship with Israel. And we have the Bible verse, right? We have the Exodus verse, Israel is my firstborn son, right? That God sees us as the firstborn child, the rest of the nations of the world also as God's children. But we get a double portion compared to the other nations of the world. Everyone gets a portion in this world. We also get a portion in the world to come. And that this is a promise by God not to revoke that portion because of our sins, particularly I'm thinking in regards to the sleeping with the concubine being the golden calf, not to revoke our portion of the world to come because we have gone astray from our promises at Sinai. With that said, you have to ask yourself, who's the hated wife, right? Because otherwise this makes no sense. And we do get a lot of prophetic mentions, and in particular, I'm thinking of a prophecy in Ezekiel that say, that call Israel the child of a harlot, right? And that we were born out of a combination of God and the circumstances of idolatry that we arose out of.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it's in some ways quite a stretch, and in some ways perfectly reasonable, as exactly you put it, because Israel is called B'ni B'chori Yisrael. My Israel is my firstborn, right? And so the whole setup here is that, like, you favor the younger, you favor the quieter, you favor the weaker, you favor all the way through the gentler, until Israel becomes that. And then it's like, even though we're a tiny nation, even though we're the smaller, weaker, whatever, I don't know how, nevertheless, we're the firstborn. We've been chosen. The idea is God chooses the firstborn as opposed to just whatever comes out. And that becomes kind of how we think of ourselves, how we define. Yonatan then moves to take that to say, so we remember we're the firstborn, our inheritance can't be revoked, is the message of Deuteronomy, no matter what we do. I was sort of, as you were talking, Yonatan, I just must say that I was thinking in another direction, like maybe we're the kind of firstborn that is chosen and not born. So the Reuben story is a way of saying the actual firstborn, he's like, the other nations are disgusting. The other nations are Esau, because we do this with Esau, we do this with Ishmael, right? When there's no real reason to. Ishmael and Esau are actually pretty sympathetic characters, largely. But Reuben actually is not such a sympathetic character. So we could cut this either way. Is Reuben the reason why, like, are we Joseph? We're Jacob. Get used to it. We're the younger child, and that's the way this works. Or are we now the elect, the firstborn, and our rights can't be stripped from? And in either case, whatever Deuteronomy is doing seems to be a kind of a pushback or on Genesis, and an affirmation of this principle. Nope, the firstborn cannot be usurped. Okay. Payam.
At first, he talked about laws and stories and why the connection. And part of the story of a law is, why does the law exist in the first place? And what's being done with Reuben is saying, this is how other societies always did it, that the firstborn, when the father was weak, and in a state of being weak, the firstborn showed his dominance and became the alpha male by sleeping with the concubine of the father. And so in order to prevent this from occurring in our society, we're going to pass this law. Henceforth, the firstborn of the hated will still receive a portion in order to prevent this outcome, i.e. from the firstborn sleeping with a concubine, in order to inherit everything and show that they're the alpha.
Good, Payam. Payam's doing some important insinuating here. That is to say, Payam is suggesting that there's weird stuff going on in these families. And there's, in Jacob's family especially, the problem is not just the favoring of children. That's been an earlier problem. Jacob favored among his wives. Jacob played favorites between his wives and potentially created this sort of, if Leah is giving birth and saying, perhaps finally my husband will love me, something's wrong in that relationship, clearly, in that family. And it's got to affect everyone. And Reuben, perhaps, who just deserves to be the firstborn and go, perhaps, let's think a little bit about where Reuben is coming from, the Ben Hasnuah, the son of the hated woman, and who's named after her suffering. Now, eventually, Payam suggests that Reuben gets some idea that what you do is you kind of marry your way, or you sleep your way, or you kind of take your way into the established position. There's a way in which he's sort of doing what his father did, just marrying, sleeping with all these women. There's a messaging there. And remember, Jacob calls him the first fruit of my vigor. To make this point even deeper, let's go back one source and look at Reuben is born and then eventually sleeps with his father's wife. And in the middle, the only other thing we hear about Reuben is another very strange story that has all kinds of bizarre sexual overtones. So take a look at this story, one source back. Here, that means source number, we just looked at source number 5, so we're going to go to source number 4. So this happened before then, okay, before Reuben slept with Bilhah. Reuben went out during the days of the wheat harvest and found some mandrakes in the field. Now, the word in Hebrew is dudaim, and it's a beautiful word. It's related to the word for love, and that is because the mandrakes, this is their translation, are thought of as an aphrodisiac. Okay, so he found love potion number 9 out there. Now listen to this. Reuben went out during the days of the wheat harvest, found some mandrakes in the field, and he brought them to his mother Leah. Now that's a weird thing to do. That's a weird thing to do. Hey mom, I found an aphrodisiac. And the story gets weirder. And Rachel said to Leah, please give me of some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, was it not enough for you to take away my husband, that you would also take my son's mandrakes? And Rachel replied, I promise, he shall lie with you tonight. You get to have sex with Jacob tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes, these dudaim. Now that is about as effed up, I guess I'll say, a family dynamic as I can imagine. What the heck is going on here? And let me just, as I've done in the bold, let me just highlight the fact that in every line of this very short exchange is the phrase, your son's mandrakes. They're not just dudaim, they're not just Aphrodite, but it's Reuben's mandrakes. Reuben, who found these mandrakes and brought them straight to his mom. What's going on here in this family? What's going on with Reuben? And part of what I like about what Payam was doing is it's horrifying, but let's try to imagine, where does such disturbing behavior come from? How does someone get the idea that boundaries are this porous in a family? I don't know, just to put it one way, I don't know. All right, let's turn back to our scholars. Rabbi Len.
Hey, so I had wanted to comment on what you were talking about before about Reuben, but I'll just say one thing in answer or a thought related to what you just brought up about the mandrakes. We know that Jacob had this enormous love for Rachel, much more than Leah. Leah's the hated one, or at least the disdained and disrespected one. But we'll never find any statement in the Torah that Rachel loved Jacob. I think this may have been a totally one-sided love affair between Jacob and Rachel. But when you look, as you said, at the whole family dynamic, Jacob had reason to disdain Leah. She took the place of the woman he wanted to marry. She was put up to it by her father. Reuben had reason to hate his father. He was doing terrible things to his mother, treating his mother. This could easily have been an intentional way to get back at his father, what he did with Bilhah. But it seems to me that the Torah has a tendency to see that we as humans go off course and head in directions that are not so good. And with things like the Shemitah and the Yovel, the Torah wants to give us a way to get back like to the status quo ante, to get back to where things were good. And this may be part of it, saying, yeah, Jacob hated Reuben, Reuben hated Jacob, but he's still got to get the inheritance of the firstborn, and maybe this hatred won't continue from generation to generation to generation, that the firstborn gets the birthright, gets the double portion, and maybe that's a way of trying to get things back on track for us human beings.
Yeah. Very elegantly put. I really appreciate that whole framework, and you gave us a lot of further nuances in the story, because after all, nobody's innocent here. I mean, Jacob seems to be the primary perpetrator, the great sort of the patriarch and the trickster but Leah did trick Jacob, and I'm thinking, as you're talking about, some of us are familiar with like family therapy and family systems kind of theories, where a family is sick. And if there's an abuser in a family, that might be the person propelling the action, but everybody starts to be shaped by the sickness of the family. And this is just a family where nobody is acting in a healthy way, one might claim. And so the Deuteronomy is trying to say, stop this madness. It's just like have a family that makes sense, where people do right by each other. And if we have to legislate it, all right, we'll legislate it, because you people can't handle it, right? Leah was heading there earlier. So that's certainly a strong way to read this. Okay, we have a few more minutes. Let's hear from Mark and Jen before we close. Mark.
I think another thing that illustrates this is back in Genesis, the story of Rachel giving birth, which is, you may have it as a source, Genesis 35, starting at verse 16 and following. And in particular, the story here is they're on the road. Rachel, you've got it? Good. Perfect. Right there, verse 18. So Rachel is dying in childbirth, and she ends up naming the child she gives birth to Ben-Oni, which is the same language that we had before about Reuven, but his father doesn't call him Ben-Oni, he calls him Binyamin.
Wow.
And there is Jacob resisting the ultimate cry out of this wife, even though he considers her to be beloved. How many relationships are there where the husband and the wife just really don't get each other? And this is such a dynamic and powerful reversal.
Right. Wow.
Yeah. Wow.
Wow. No, I mean, I'm sort of spinning from what you've done here, because it's not just that there's a parallel between the
No, it's the psychological components.
right, but it's a parallel inverse, right? We saw in, just to remind us of what Mark has been able to do here, which is really remarkable. We saw that Leah named her son Reuben, look, a son, but she actually meant by it, look at my affliction, right? For now my husband will look. So Rachel ends up, as she dies, doing something similar, which is naming a son Ben-Oni, which seems to mean like the child of my suffering. But in this case, his father called him something else, the son of my right hand. But it's also the case that on here is the similar language that Jacob uses to describe Reuben, the first fruit of my vigor. So there's a kind of there's too much to unpack here. But what Mark has done is really wonderful and striking, which is that there's a parallel here that shows that Rachel is also suffering, trying to express herself, naming her children one thing, and having her husband not see that, because after all, isn't that what Leah said to Jacob? Look, I bore you, look at me. Look at my suffering, look at my child, look at me, pay attention to me. And Jacob doesn't get it, right? Doesn't see it. And he didn't see Rachel either. What Rabbi Len said about that it never says that Rachel loved Jacob. That's interesting, right? It's like this guy, and he's in love, and he has hate, especially in a world where love and hate are not the primary variables in a marriage. But Jacob's into that. Jacob has these valences, these preferences, these. All right. Yeah. Okay. One last comment from Jen.
I'm really struck by how utterly inadequate like wealth and land inheritance is for like addressing family conflict, and how like that's actually like kind of what Jacob's trying to do here. And it doesn't work, and it doesn't work. We see in contemporary life with like wills or relationships between nations. And it doesn't work with God trying to work out a relationship with the people of Israel through land inheritance. I mean, we just see constantly in the Torah that like people aren't appreciating it the way God expected, or it's not being obtained in an easy way, or like it's so much of Torah is showing us that wealth and land inheritance is like not really effective as a medium for relationships. And this law trying to take it off the table on some level, like just don't debate about it. Here's the law, here's the rule. Go work out your relationship some other way. Don't do it with this. And yet at the same time can like actually be the spark for even more of those conflicts. So sorry, this isn't a very conclusive comment, but like it really feels to me like there's this like open question of, okay, obviously the way of addressing this inheritance is not, it didn't work, didn't solve anything. Yeah. So in what way is this law going to address or help or not help all of the messiness that happens in our relationships that we try to summarize in a metaphor about money and land and fail out all the time?
That's very, very well put, and it's a very, I mean, that's a very kind of devastating critique that you're offering, because we so often, when we look back at Genesis, I did it today. When we look back at Genesis, we sort of justify it by thinking of, well, the thing that they're passing on is a covenant, and a covenant is holy. A covenant is about God, and got to pick the right person, and and it's also, it's not just whoever's born first gets. It's not, it's merit based. There's lots of ways to justify it, but at the end of the day, a lot of what happens is like property and land being transferred in the covenant. And so what ends up happening is that Genesis is a story of these men most of the time, unless like Rebecca like figures out a way to get around it, just sort of sitting back and saying like, I choose thee, thou art the inheritor, and maybe God is the first male pronoun figure to start doing that. Maybe God screwed this all up, and that's part of the critique. That's a deep place to go, and I don't know, but yeah, it's just like maybe Deuteronomy is saying, don't do that. This is not a way to show love, right? Jen kept saying it's not a way to like fix family problems. It's not a way to show love. You can inherit from me. It's like, I'm not sure that the double portion of the birthright is the best solution, but at least it's a rule. that isn't like, that is apparent to all. All right, we have to close, but I want to say there's a whole part two to our story. There's a whole, if we're looking at the story of Reuben and trying to understand what made Reuben who he is, and how is it that he was so disinherited that he became almost like he's the first of the children. And we mentioned Joseph, we mentioned Judah, we mentioned lots of, we don't think of Levi, right? But no, there's no Reuben. So the whole second half of this discussion really has to, we just don't have time for it today, but we really have to start thinking about also the way that Reuben behaves among his brothers. And Reuben there too is unstable as water. He plays a very strange role in the selling of Joseph, where he kind of tries to stop it but fails. And then I'll just read one line here. When they're trying to get Joseph back to their rations from Egypt, and so they have to get Benjamin to go back to Egypt, and Jacob is worried about it, Reuben suggests that you can trust Reuben because he says to his father, you may kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Like, what? Reuben's just a weird, there's a whole, like, look at how much text there. We really have to analyze these stories in a deep way to understand that there are other narrative reasons why Reuben is not the perfect person to inherit the family, why Judah rises to the front, why Joseph rises to the front. Reuben, there is something wrong with Reuben. There is. I mean, he slept with his father's wife. I mean, that enough, but like, even in his dealings with his brother, he's an odd and sort of unpredictable character. And he is in some ways a failed birthright. But did he deserve to be kicked out in the way that he was? Did he deserve to be treated the way? What else happened back then that screwed him up? If nothing else, did he deserve to have his father hate his mother, to be born into that circumstance? So there are 2 sides to this debate. If you want to take a look at the Sforno takes up the side that this law is good because the Sforno takes up the side that the law is good, but Jacob had the right because Reuben acted so terribly. Whereas others of us saw this law as a critique on Jacob, a way of saying this, whatever what was happening in the book of Genesis shouldn't be happening anymore. I'll just say 2 last things. We're over time, but 2 last things. There's whatever else is true, the memory of Reuben is sort of embedded in this horrible moment. There's like, he crossed a line. And so Reuben has a story of suffering, and Reuben has a story of like extreme behavior, and Reuben has a story of playing an odd role in his pack of brothers. Reuben has a lot of story. Reuben has a life that is complicated and seemingly difficult. But Reuben is remembered in the book of Chronicles. Reuben, the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, he was the firstborn, but when he disgraced his father's couch, his birthright was given to the son of Joseph, son of Israel. So he is not reckoned as firstborn in the genealogy. For though Judah was the mightiest of his brothers, the leader would come from him, yet the birthright belonged to Joseph. Now, that's in some ways the conclusion of Reuben's story. The thing that he's remembered for is that great sexual transgression. But listen to how it's all still so complicated. And then there's Judah, and Judah was the most powerful. And actually, the king is going to come from Judah. But Joseph is the one that got the blessing, the first. And Reuben's not, even though he is the firstborn, he's not the firstborn according to the genealogy. It's still a mess. It's still unclear. I don't think we've totally solved this case. But I will say this just in closing, which is that one of the things we have to do when we read the book of Deuteronomy and we read these laws is to ask, what's the story behind the law? We've been asking that this whole time. And in this case, it's Reuben's story. It's the story of a person, an ancestor of ours, who had a strange and terrible life and failed to achieve something that seemed promised to him, and was written out of our history in a way. right? And so if nothing else, this kind of law teaches us that we have to look behind the laws at the story, because everybody's got a story and everybody's got a family and everybody's got pain. And one of the lessons when we see something in the Torah like this that is so clearly referencing an entire narrative, just like a turn of phrase, one of the things the Torah is telling us is to try to remember whose pain have you forgotten? Whose pain have you forgotten? Whose story have you forgotten? Right? And that's one of the things that we have to think about as we head into this time of self-reflection, especially when we think about our families. So let's leave it there. Thank you all for your Torah today. Really appreciate your insights. Really helped begin to unpack. There's a lot more unpacking to do. See you next week. Great learning with you all. Kol Tov.